faire l'interview ici. Faites faire l'interview. Non, j'allais faire là-haut parce qu'on enchaîne ici sur le plateau direct. Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous. C'est par l'escalier là à gauche. Ok, ça marche là.
Paniquez pas.
Your bag, you can do you want me to reach it at the...
Okay, please. It's okay.
Je sais pas sur quoi je marche. Petit câblé. Plus avec un bord. Bon, je vais faire les deux à chaque, il n'est pas là le technicien. Tu peux mettre du son dans lui? Vous connaissez bien, hein, vous avez l'habitude, parce qu'ils sont assez directionnels, donc c'est pas parler comme ça. Merci. Deuxième micro.
Oui.
Je vois plus rien. Un. Mais plus de son. C'est ça.
And other points
Sur le filaire.
that were
Filaire,
not in my draft that you want to...
You know, it would be like maybe important to highlight female whistleblower.
Un, deux, un, deux. Ah. Ouais. Un. Et voilà. Un.
Okay.
And how even if the hysteria about the Trump administration, she got some support from MSG and I think that we can make an appeal who's introducing us.
I think so.
I do. Which wording are you using?
Your words.
The ones that's
You will introduce... I will just say that you're a journalist, that you work with WikiLeaks, now you work with...
yeah, it works.
You worked. Now you work at the Courage Foundation. And I will let you introduce your... if you want to.
No, that was fine. I was just checking because I don't work there anymore. So
Yeah,
it's not,
I know.
Not many people.
You're still lawyer of WikiLeaks?
Yes. You like that.
Is it possible to speak about the actual condition of Julian?
Yeah.
And the report that surfaced yesterday about his medical condition?
No, it would be like super good to leave Julian the first part so we can move on and talk about stuff.
But it's 29 times, essentially.
This is very personal.
28 Manning and 72 WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
Well, that's data, only data. Yeah. And you're Guatemalan lawyer. Et bon, je crois. Est-ce que c'est la question qui a été posée tout à l'heure,
C'est streamé en direct.
et après il y aura du replay.
Ouais.
Ok. Everything is monitored and is streamed live, and they will have a replay. Just
The difference is that it's monitored to everyone, not just to the NSA.
you agree?
Ça marche. Bonsoir. Alors, j'ai pas de bol parce que j'ai un projecteur qui met... Voilà, donc je sais pas si on peut... Bonsoir, Jean Marc Manach, je suis journaliste. On m'a demandé de modérer cette table. Et ça va faire partie des derniers mots que je vais dire en français parce que Renata et Sarah, je vais leur parler en anglais. Elles vont me répondre en anglais. Il n'y aura pas de traduction en temps réel. Donc peut-être qu'à certains moments, s'il y a des problèmes, vous essayez de vous organiser ou vous me demandez éventuellement de traduire un mot. Mais là, on est parti pour 1 heure de live, normalement en anglais. Sachant que j'ai déjà fait des conférences en anglais, mais c'est la première fois que je modère une table ronde en anglais. Donc soyez indulgents avec mon accent, je vais faire ce que je peux. Voilà, je vous remercie. Donc par ailleurs, pour préciser pourquoi est-ce qu'on m'a demandé de modérer cette table ronde, c'est que moi, j'ai commencé à travailler en matière de sécurité. Je suis journaliste d'investigation. J'ai commencé à m'intéresser à la sécurité informatique à la fin des années 90 pour arriver à protéger mes sources. À l'époque, on ne parlait pas autant que maintenant des lanceurs d'alerte, mais c'était déjà le cas. Moi, mon premier scoop que j'ai eu grâce à la cryptographie, c'était en 2001. Et au mi-temps des années 2000, à la fin des années 2000, quand je travaillais pour un site qui s'appelait ovni.fr, on s'est retrouvé à beaucoup travailler avec Wikileaks. C'est là où j'avais rencontré Sarah, on avait travaillé à l'époque. Je continue à m'intéresser à toutes ces questions de sécurité informatique, de protection des sources, et d'où le fait qu'on m'a demandé de modérer cette table ronde qui vient... Donc on va parler d'une conversation. Women Whistleblowing Wikileaks. Donc il y a Angela Richter, qui est une auteure de théâtre, metteur en scène allemande, qui ne sera pas là avec nous ce soir. Et là, il y a Sarah Harrison, Renata Avila. Hi. So, Sarah, you were journalists. You were working with WikiLeaks, and now you are living in Berlin and working for the Courage Foundation. Can you summarize what is the Courage Foundation?
So the Courage Foundation is an organization that we set up, a group of us set up in 2014. It protects whistleblowers and what we term truth tellers. So these are whistleblowers, but also hacktivists. Anybody that has been working to put information into the public domain and is being persecuted for it. So we work for their legal defense, to raise money for it, to get their lawyers, to help their lawyers, and also for their public defense. Often these are trialed in the court of public opinion as well as the legal courts. And so we work in both these spheres to protect such people.
Renata Avila, hi. You're a Guatemalan lawyer, and one of the fighting you have is you are one of the lawyers of WikiLeaks. How many lawyers has WikiLeaks?
Far too many.
Far too many.
Far too many because, you know, when you have a global publication operation, you have to have as many lawyers as the trouble you want to make and the change you want to make. And WikiLeaks is actually one of the, I mean, if you compare it even with the scale of resources and you can compare it to an international media organization because it has published information about each and every corner in the world. Yeah. And it had partnered with over 200 media partners in each and every corner in the world. Like I will say, not in every country, but I will say that unlike mainstream media, it had exceeded like 60% of the media partners globally. And so we are a big team, and it's not only media lawyers, it's also criminal lawyers, because as you might be aware of, there's not only for WikiLeaks, but all the media partners and all the people publishing, is always this, when you expose power, power goes after you. And so we need criminal lawyers as well. And so the constellation of lawyers of WikiLeaks are basically free speech lawyers, media lawyers, criminal lawyers, and sometimes we have even specialists on asylum law, on different specific things, constitutional law, and so on in many, many countries. I have to say that most of them, and I will invite any French lawyer willing to join. Most of them, all of us, most of us, like I would say, like 98% of us, we work pro bono. And it's a side activity of our main activities because it's like the small degree of commitment that we can give back to society.
Just to add to that, to prove Renata's point, because of the work that I did with WikiLeaks and also with Edward Snowden, I'm subject to a terrorism investigation that is going on in the United Kingdom. The way that they are manipulating the Terrorism Act there is to subject journalists to this. So this included storming into the Guardian offices and has also put me in a difficult position, and means that, for example, I have a lawyer that's actually a terrorist lawyer in the UK, because that's how I'm being treated, albeit for my journalistic activities. So there really are a wide range of different types of lawyers around the world that WikiLeaks has.
But that means that you can't return in the UK?
It means that I couldn't for quite a long time. I couldn't go at all. The Terrorism Act was being used in this way. David Miranda, who was doing journalistic work with The Guardian in 2013, was stopped, and was stopped at the border under the Terrorism Act. He actually started to take a case to try and ring-fence this act so that journalists could not be stopped under it. This took many years and had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, but eventually he won. So now I am able to go, albeit with some risk, back to the UK, but I, for example, don't travel with any electronic equipment, nothing that has a password on it, etc., because the Act means that they can try and force a password off you. Now, although he won his case, so journalists in theory should be protected, especially with the terrorism acts that we had in recent months, in the UK, it means that there is still a risk. So I still have this lawyer, and there are still some risks for me. So I don't take computers or passwords when I go.
Okay. Well, this conversation, in the forewords of the book, it begins with the fact that the idea of the book began just after you returned to Berlin, 3 days after leaving the Moscow airport, where you were with Snowden for 5 weeks.
Yeah, we were in the airport for 40 days, and then I was there in Moscow for another 3 months after he'd gotten asylum, and then then came to Berlin.
And how did you live the fact that going to Hong Kong and then going to Moscow and being blocked in Moscow before? What was it like? Because it's at the moment that the world you revealed your identity to the world. I knew you were working with WikiLeaks because we worked together, but you were not a public figure until then.
No, I mean, it was a completely surreal experience. We'd been in the airport for several hours. It was clear that we were unable to leave. His passport had been blocked. Edward Snowden's passport was blocked, so we were unable to board the flight to Cuba that we had tickets for. And so we had to remain in the transit area of Moscow airport. We had no visas or anything to get into Russia, so we were just trapped in the transit zone. And it took 40 days to resolve this issue. We applied for asylum to a number of countries, most of Europe, in fact, and they either refused outright or just didn't respond and refused to respond. So we were trapped there for 40 days until eventually he put in an application to Russia. That, of course, took some processing time, and that was allowed, and we entered into Russia. The whole time was a very surreal experience. I speak about it in the book a little bit, because what was interesting to me when I arrived in Berlin, everyone sort of assumed it must have been the most exciting period of my life. There was, planes that were being downed and all of this stuff. Wasn't it cool? And I was like...
Spy film.
A spy film, yeah. And I suppose if you were watching it from the outside, then it was. But for me, we were just in one room in an airport, and that's really boring for a month. So that was quite weird then to get out and also, the other interesting, little things that I arrived in Berlin because I'd come from Hong Kong. We were on our way to Ecuador via Cuba, etc. And so I had ballet shoes. I don't know what you'd call them, like the little sort of girly slippery type things, as my shoes, because we were in hot places. And I arrived in November to Berlin, and one of my friends that was there and I saw first and was like, that's not very appropriate shoes for a Berlin winter. And I was like, no, I'm very aware of that. I'm freezing cold and we need to go shopping immediately. So yeah, it wasn't planned. So the whole thing became a very weird experience. But in the airport, I mean, everyone's transited in flights. It's a really boring experience, and normally you do it for a few hours, and we were there for 40 days. So it was boring in that way, but also tough. I mean, we were putting in asylum applications. I was also, of course, with a man that didn't know whether he would be alive in a few days. What would happen to him? He was missing his girlfriend. You know, it was a very tough time in that. So it was a stressful time, but also much more boring than people seem to think that I must have had such an exciting time there, and way too much Burger King.
Yeah, I remember that when I asked you, exactly, when I asked you after you returned to Berlin, what was it like? And you talked about this hamburger, you were fed up with hamburgers.
No,
it's really the only thing you told me.
I was fixated. Honestly, it took me about 2 years to even be able to walk by a Burger King. The smell made me feel a bit nauseous because it was just way too much. So yeah.
And you explain in the book that we were non-participants in these incredible events that we were watching live on the internet. So like zombies, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, there was internet, so I was aware that these things were going on, and that, in fact, almost made you more detached because you could see them going on and your name was being put there. Obviously, Snowden had way more visibility than me, but there was still even a hashtag of my name, and I was like, this is really, really weird. But you're still really detached from it because we just only saw each other. So there was no engagement at all in these global events that were going on.
At the same time, Renata, you were in the Ecuador embassy in London with Julian, and it was his anniversary.
Well, I was having the real fun, you know.
Just surreal.
Yes, the real fun, because basically it takes a village to save Snowden. To be completely honest, and it was a constellation of people who will like to remain anonymous forever, who make that happen. And Sarah was the courageous, visible face of that. But it was a lot of people and a lot of actions from a lot of countries and a lot of resources put into saving Snowden. And I was on the other end. I remember they had the reason why I was in London. I had my job. I was doing some human rights cases, and I was in London because there was a birthday party of Julian, and because at that time, and it's something that many people do not know, we were this close to get Julian out. There was at that time the Ecuadorians had brought with the UK a commission to negotiate his release. And actually, I think that basically activating this rescue of Snowden made those plans fall apart, and that's not a well-known fact. If Julian, WikiLeaks, and all the people around wouldn't have saved Snowden, maybe Julian will be out.
So Julian is in because Snowden is out?
No, it's not. It's just a speculation, but it was the first time that the UK government showed the willingness to negotiate. And then after the Snowden rescue, that fell apart. So that's why many lawyers were present around there. But I remember it was a very interesting evening because there was many journalists. John Pilger was there, and also Roman Gavras, who's from here, was around, and lots of people. And you expect that the birthday person will be present. Not only present physically, but present and saying hi, and being social, and so on. And Julian had 8 computers open, monitoring flight times, monitoring all the news channels, monitoring flight route, even. And
because he was trying, WikiLeaks was also trying to induce in errors the secret services for them not to know exactly which plane you were supposed to take.
And it was many things that I can disclose here, but among the things, one interesting thing was, the interesting thing is the allies and the people that we counted on that could save Snowden were not the European nations. And always Europe is human rights, human blah. And were not the mainstream human rights organizations. You didn't see, the thing is that we were WikiLeaks was the last resort cushion to save Snowden, because you didn't see the president of Amnesty International going there, or Transparency International, or Human Rights Watch, or even FEED. I mean, they didn't even want to be even remotely associated to Snowden. The situation have changed. Did you see the
since
ACLU,
they began to fight against surveillance, etc.
Yeah, the ACLU head only went to Moscow 6 months after Snowden was granted asylum. And then you measure, and that made me reflect, it is really fragile. It's really fragile, the infrastructure that we have to protect dissidents in the West. It's really vulnerable and fragile because funding, public opinion, public relations, private relations, and associations of human rights organizations are too close to power to be effective.
One thing that was quite stunning for me is that the book is entitled Women Whistleblowing Wikileaks, and it effectively deals with WikiLeaks, but a lot more with Snowden and Manning than of women or whistleblowing. And the main things in the book, it's politics, it's dissent, it's dissidence, it's revolution.
Yeah, I mean, we very much wanted to speak about the broader topics. So yeah, we do speak about WikiLeaks. A lot of that is in the context of publishing strategies, how one should publish, comparing different publishing strategies. We speak about whistleblowing generally, and of course, as you say, with Snowden and Manning a lot. And then when it comes to women, what we actually wanted to do, we sat down to have, it's a conversation that we had in 2014. And what we very much wanted to do was to not go into feminist issues, not because they're not important, but what we wanted to do was to actually give women a voice in global issues that affect everyone, and wider issues as well. And we felt very much that us being women having this sort of conversation about these topics that you often hear men speaking about, technology, surveillance, global justice, that was making a point in and of itself to put women in this sphere. And so that was very much something that we set out to do, was to speak about these issues from the perspective of women and as women, but to keep it very much on that sort of global sphere.
You have something to add, or?
Well, I have to add as well that is often the mainstream voice of women that you get is white Western women. I know that Sarah is one, but for me it was a great opportunity to bring up issues. You know, one of the issues in the book that I hope that you can buy, so you can support whistleblowers. One of the topics of the book, one of the people I mentioned Zapatista Comandante Ramona. You know, everyone knows about Comandante Marcos and the Zapatistas, and they do not know about Comandante Ramona, that was the second in command. It was this amazing woman, that Joan of Arc of the Zapatista revolution, who was for a long period of time leading the revolution of the most underprivileged people in Mexico. So for me, like having a voice and trying to show a little bit of the reality where I come from and the different challenges for women in my country was a great opportunity. I mean, I think that women from my part of the world, we have a lot of women talking about us. About us, about the poor women in Latin America, and the poor indigenous women in Latin America, or the poor underprivileged women in Latin America. But what about what we think about all of these issues?
And not only women issues.
It's not only women issues, it's global issues, it's global politics, and it is the impact of war in our lives, it's the impact of corrupt politicians destroying our countries and just destroying the possibility of changing things. So this book was a great opportunity to make the conversation more close to people, and not only discussing, oh yes, women are discriminated, blah.
I think it's worth pointing out that Angela, yes, she's white, but she's from Croatia, or the former Yugoslavia. So we are from quite different backgrounds. I'm extraordinarily privileged, and the white UK, sort of, other than being a man from my country, pretty much one of the most privileged people in the world, and the other two come from extremely different backgrounds. And that was another important point to us, to bring as far as we could within a small setting.
And that's something that is in the book, is that most of the media, most of the politicians talks from the white, talks from the rich, talks from the male, and that is not what is in the book. And one thing that was quite interesting is this sentence, is that you wrote, and you agree, it seems that you agree, that Manning helped stop a war and start a revolution, contrary to Snowden, who uncovered lots of scandals, but the real effect of whistleblowing, it's Chelsea Manning, much more than Snowden.
I mean, yes, and this is not to do with either of the two whistleblowers themselves, but yes, it was interesting to us that, yes, Snowden had albeit there are many people that have issue with him, but he has a more positive, or certainly did at that time when we were speaking, many more people had a more positive view of him. Manning, there were articles that were being written taking issue with that she was trans, was she gay, etc., that were quite derogatory whilst she was in prison. But the actual effects of the tangible effects of the documents that were disclosed were that it was part of the Iraq, finally the US troops being withdrawn from Iraq, one of the sparks of the Arab Spring, and these were really tangible effects, but as dear Michael Ratner put it, they were to brown people. And so in the Western media, these were not seen and promoted so much. Now, Snowden, actually, certainly when we were speaking in 2014, the tangible effects of changes to surveillance, now many more people may know about it, but the laws, even still today, generally, if anything, have just been to legalize the illegal behavior that was going on. And so it was interesting for us to examine and to discuss what these phenomenon, why they could be. The effects of Ed's revelations were very much about white people as opposed to Manning's.
And if I may say, I think that the Snowden revelations are more the methods of corruption and the methods of capture and the methods of cheating on the game. Because you will see in the revelations of Snowden how, for example, in the multilateral arena, Americans were spying on diplomats, or in the academic and research arena, they were hacking into universities in China. But it's the cheating, it's the unethical behavior and so on. But the revelations of Manning are the concrete outcomes, the concrete effect on the lives of people. You will see the killing of children, the killing of journalists, the
collateral murder video.
But not only the collateral murder, actually the Couso was a cameraman in Spain, and the documents of WikiLeaks were used for his case to be prosecuted. I mean, and many others. I mean, I invite everyone. I mean, it's very entertaining, and you can choose the country of your preference, and the archive of WikiLeaks of all the documents. I mean, it's really fun to write last names, you know, and dates that you remember of political events that you are interested into. And getting that picture, getting the picture and getting the reports from the embassies, it tells a lot. In the case of my country, actually it was very surprising to see that actually, paradoxically, because Guatemala, I mean, there was a coup in 1954 that destroyed the democratic revolution in my country, but years after, even the embassy was even more decent than the corrupt elite in my country, and the WikiLeaks cables unveil it. And so that I think that's the difference, is giving global perspective of each and every country in the world and how politics operate locally and how close, far, and not because of closeness it means corruption, not because of distance means that they're decent people. I mean, it's a picture of a moment of time, and it really exposes the elites. It really exposes that what the press has failed to expose in so long.
Speaking of WikiLeaks archives, Sarah explained that when you were a little girl, your secret dream was of being a librarian. And now I'm working at WikiLeaks, the coolest library in the world. And can you explain about what is scientific journalism, this concept of scientific journalism?
So that was actually something that Julian had spoken of a lot and had written papers about as he was putting together his ideas of what WikiLeaks would be. And it's actually something that attracted me a lot. Before I went into journalism, I'd actually done science at university. And so I had a very sort of scientific mind and the concept of going back to the raw data, the source documents. And so scientific journalism, which was the phrase that Julian would use to explain within journalism the concept that this should also be the case, that the reader should be able to go to the source documents, that it shouldn't just be that the journalist reads it and does their analysis and their reporting, which of course is very important, and good journalism will give good context and good explanations. But however great the journalism is, as with science, the reader should be able to go and have a look at the source documents. And this was something I found very appealing because of my science background, and also I saw within journalism this would then allow readers their own ability to interact with that data themselves. And that was something I really saw in my work at WikiLeaks, that great citizen journalism came out of us putting databases online. People went and found things that journalists, even the best journalists, just didn't. There were, whether it was because of the quantity of data or just local expertise, there was some great citizen journalism. And so I was very proud that this concept that Julian had come up with of scientific journalism was borne out in our work.
May I add something that for me is very interesting, that it was beyond just, you know, the experts and the journalists. I think, and it's a pity that as Angela cannot be here because she's pregnant with twins and about to release the twins, but the artistic movement as well. And it is amazing for me to see artists taking these documents and making cultural and artistic objects out of it. It happened a lot with Snowden revelations and with the Manning revelations, and it is sparkled like it. I think the people and the level of understanding goes through different levels, the logical and the emotional, and the aesthetic one. And we often just stay at the logical and factual, and I think that's a limited experience for humans to understand something. And by releasing documents and by having these documents exposed, and by having them available for everyone, I think that sparkle this curiosity from the artistic movement, especially in Europe and to some extent globally, on doing plays, doing visual exhibitions, data experiments and so on. And I find it very cool.
There's another thing in the conversation. It's the difference between the way Glenn Greenwald managed the Snowden documents and the way WikiLeaks managed the Manning documents. And you wrote that both Aaron Swartz, who committed suicide years ago, and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, was fighting in order that everybody should have unlimited and free access to knowledge and not redact documents or publish only extracts of documents. Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, something that WikiLeaks had done was to publish full archives, full documents, and it had cost us a lot. I mean, there were big PR battles when the Afghan war logs were put out. There was a large fight. It was an interesting propaganda one in that we were releasing literally the information of the United States, knowledge of them, how they killed tens of thousands of people, and they managed to turn it that we had blood on our hands for releasing the fact that they'd done this. But we stayed strong, and we were, I would say, from at least from my perspective, we were winning that battle, at least to some extent, and we were making great ground in it. It was then very sad to me, and we've had this discussion with Glenn many times, including on Twitter. We have a great agree to disagree on some of these things. We haven't fallen out about it, but we think it's an important debate to have in the public domain because there were different approaches. And I very much think that WikiLeaks had proven that there was great benefit to its publication strategy. And it was extraordinarily sad to me to see Glenn and other journalists with the Snowden documents going and redacting. And what was interesting to me was what they were redacting and why. And there's a very good example of this, that they were going to the
Project X. Country X.
Country X. So it was a document that was explaining where the US government was doing full collection on phone calls, and they put the document out with one of the countries, the Bahamas, being named, and the other country was redacted. And to me, this was extraordinary. So that whole country can't know that the US is collecting all their phone calls, and the reason it was redacted was because US agencies had said that this might harm national security. What they actually meant by that was US national interests. In the end, the name of the country came out because WikiLeaks actually released the name of the country, and there was no harm that had been caused, as anybody has quantified, but actually it was Afghanistan, and the president actually tried to start to remove US surveillance bases, which of course they took issue with. But there was no harm to national security that anybody was able to actually quantify. And so to me, this was a very good example of when a journalist is taking their decisions on what they should put out or not from government agencies, who they are revealing about, you will of course get skewed information and skewed points of view on this. And this, I think, for the people, if the citizens of Afghanistan, was a great shame if the country name had never come out.
May I say something that just to add from the perspective of a human rights lawyer? Actually, when we were working on the genocide case with Rigoberta Menchú in Guatemala, you need big database to identify a pattern of killings. You need to a large database and play with the database names, chain of command. You need loads of data to build a case of crimes against humanity. And by just releasing a document is useless. Well, it's useful on a date and time, but to document a pattern and to document a policy, state policy of extermination of people, or a state policy of abuse, you need big data. I mean, the marketing guys need big data. The people in industry need big data. Human rights lawyers and journalists need big data.
And that's another thing that you explain in the book, is that before working with WikiLeaks, you work with the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Association in order to prove the genocide that happened in your country, and you had to manage lots of data about it.
Yes, well, it was not lots of that. It was lots of paper, you know.
Yeah.
It was an interesting transition. I was a very junior lawyer. I was 25, and imagine Nobel Prizes, calls, and say like, "Okay, I got your CV. I think that you will be a good fit," and you're terrified because it is many barriers. You know, I just blab some words of some of the indigenous languages in my country, but there are 24. I only knew words in 2. And you are intimidated by this figure, Rigoberta Menchú, who is like a Nobel Prize. And I arrived, when I arrived, it was a room full of papers.
That you have to computerize and...
Yes, and we work over 2 years to systematize the evidence from paper to
like
digital
to
databases to finding patterns. And it makes me think a lot today about one of the conflicts, for instance, Syria. Everything is digital. Everything you can find is the most documented conflict of our times, and yet nothing is happening on justice, and nothing is happening on accountability.
YouTube began to erase some of the videos documenting the atrocities in Syria. That's completely crazy.
And we discussed that in the book as well, the privatization of things that should be public utilities and the decline of funding. I mean, I don't know if the Ministry of Culture is around, but when we delegate our archives and the mechanisms to record our history and to record important things.
But I think it was 3 months ago that someone has been condemned based on the video of execution he put online on YouTube. And he has finally been condemned.
Well, one case.
Yes, one case. There's a sentence in the book that could have made the baseline of the book. It's when you explain that it may be that the computer is the AK-47 of our age. Can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in the context of us
Yeah.
talking about surveillance and,
Yeah.
and things. And
You're-
no, I mean, just so within that context, I was trying to liken the fact that, yes, computers are used to surveil us. Your phone is obviously a computer these days. Everyone with a smartphone, we carry them everywhere. They're used as surveillance for us everywhere. And this is obviously terrible and essentially it becomes a tool of oppression. However, there are actually tools that are being put out there that are also able to help protect us. And so I was using the analogy with an AK-47 of, a government, an oppressive regime can go and they can shoot the people that are in their country. But with the AK-47 that was essentially became an affordable weapon that revolutionary groups could buy and own and arm their group with, they could then fight back. And I think that this is an analogy to computers and with the free software movement and anti-surveillance tools, privacy-enhancing technology that we have coming out today. That it is an analogy, and that yes, computers can be used as an oppressive tool by governments with the surveillance technologies, but we can also use precisely the same tool ourselves, own it properly, and use the same thing to fight back. So that was the maybe polarizing analogy I was making.
And as the Snowden example shows, I mean, it works.
It works. And it works more and we are more and more people using encryption tools. I think that one of the most interesting for me moment in the conversation was when you were talking about Googlement and when you were talking about Daesh and the Silicon Valley. Can you? It's Angela who started to explain that. Angela Richter, who is not with us tonight. We don't have government. We have Googlement. Can you?
Well, I can explain it quite well because it's what's happening in my side of the world. Like we faced like 20 years or more of privatization, and free trade agreements that locked that really like gave away vital functions of infrastructure and key infrastructure of governments away to companies. And that was, at least in countries in Latin America and Africa, but to a big extent in Europe, in parallel to the growing power of Silicon Valley.
So more and more private companies, less and less government.
Not only that, more and more the same companies, and that's different. The same 5 companies are providing vital infrastructure to everyone. And the thing is that they play with the rules of California. They don't play with what I call my constitution. They don't play by the UN Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They don't care about that. They care about a little bit, sometimes when convenient, about the US Constitution, and that's it. Free market, no ethics. And now we have 5 tech giants with not only economical power, with political power. If you manage the email services of entire nations, if you manage the infrastructure, the informational infrastructure of entire continents, you have far more than just financial and economic power.
Because you oppose ISIS, the Islamic State, who wants to occupy a territory and to control over resources and to create these states. But the other problem is that the Silicon Valley, who want to control everybody's mind,
Precisely.
which you explain that is far more dangerous.
And now, not only more dangerous, I mean, ISIS, the Quran mandates the creation of a state. They can follow in this very, very primitive way of interpreting the sacred text. on the other hand, for the maximization, it's not only what moves Silicon Valley, I think, is not only the maximization of profit, is the maximization of power and control. And what I'm seeing is, especially in those, we are at a key moment in history. 50% of the world is connected. But what Silicon Valley sees of this situation is 50% of humans are not connected yet. And those 50% of humans are like the most unpredictable and the most vulnerable, but also the most dangerous, because are those the most oppressed because of social injustice, are the global poor, basically. And so they're a target group, I think, for the companies to get them connected and control as soon as possible. Biometric control, geolocalization. I mean, the magic of internet that many...
And the fact that the Google wants to be able to respond to your questions before you manage to ask Google these same questions. That's why Rick Kurzweil has been engaged by Google.
God, if only was only Google, but it's also Facebook, but it's also Alibaba. I mean, don't leave the Chinese out of the picture, because they have the plan as well, you know.
Because and you explained that the worst is probably to come, because we have yet to experiment with super intelligence, and these guys in Silicon Valley will have in their hands the power to control a machine that's more intelligent than humans, and that's paid by government. So the word Googlement or GAFAment.
And you know, the interesting thing is there's basically two actors, China and US. And what happened with Europe? That's an open question. I mean, Europe used to at least dominate these fields of science, and it's gone. The leadership of Europe is gone in that respect.
We've got the free RGPD, comme on dit en français, le règlement européen pour la protection des données, the free directive, European directive on GDPR to protect European data.
And that's also an exciting moment, because we need to decide in the next 18 months whether we want the European model to prevail in the world or
the US.
Not the US, the rest of the world model, kind of, the rest of the, yeah.
At the end of the book, you remember when you were talking with Michael Ratner, who was one of your legal advisor and mentors, and you were saying that I work so much for Julian and Snowden and nothing changes. And do you remember what he explained?
You know, just to explain of who Michael Ratner was. I mean, he was an American constitutional lawyer, but he was the lawyer of the Black Panthers, the lawyer of the Cuban Five, the lawyer of the Attica case, and the first lawyer to bring the Guantanamo Bay case to the Supreme Court of Justice in the U.S. So he was a giant, you know. We were like just these amateur lawyers hanging out with him, and you know, like it was a big responsibility and a little bit of hopelessness. Like, we will never be able to be like you. And this is, I think, that my generation, and we need to deliver results fast. And it has been quite frustrating to see that Snowden is still in Moscow. I mean, Europe is still such coward continent that cannot stand up to the Americans, even with Trump, and grant Snowden asylum. And U.S. is going to, you know, like to chaos. And journalists, not only Julian, but more and more journalists are being persecuted, prosecuted, and surveilled. And it's a very pessimistic scenario, and you see where is the hope. But the hopelessness shouldn't be an excuse to stop doing what is right.
Yeah, he responded to you, you don't do that because you're going to win and you're going to solve this problem just like that. It's not easy, but you have to keep fighting because it's the right thing to do. And Sarah, you responded that I'm politically active because I couldn't not be. simply as that, rather than because I necessarily believe we are going to change much in the short term. So we are arriving at the end, we have 5-10 minutes left. What can we do? Because in the book, in the conversation, you explained that you had hope in 2014, a little bit less in 15, and a little bit less hope in 16 with the election of Trump, etc. And now Julian, that he's still stuck in the embassy.
And now we're in 2018 and it's even more depressing. A very pessimistic friend of ours read this and said, "My God, you're even worse than I am." I wish I had like a really positive message to give, and I just sort of don't, unfortunately.
We had so much more people using encryption tools than it was before Snowden, for instance.
Yeah, but encryption is a tool of resistance. It's not a tool of creativity. And I mean, we are resisting, we are not pushing back, and we need to get back terrain, because I think that we have been pushed. Internet of Things is invading us with these sensors everywhere. Democracy is not on the rise, it's on the downside. But in spite of that, I think that the precarious situation that we are living into is the wake-up call we were waiting for, because if we don't wake up now, I mean, in Europe, I volunteer with the DiEM25, Yanis Varoufakis movement for democracy in Europe. And as a non-European, it's really interesting to see the numbers. If you look at all the up to 50 nations, not only EU, Europe in general, and the race of the far right and the precarious situation of everyone in Europe, austerity measures, unemployment, even environmental deterioration and so on. And if Europeans do not wake up now, the most advanced part of the world is Europe in terms of rights. And if we lose Europe, it's not only a loss for Europe, it's a loss for the rest of the world, because then it would be like the Chinese model and the American model, the ones prevailing. And we will all lose things. I mean, we lost here in this continent millions of lives. We lost a lot of people fighting for what is right and fighting for universal human rights, and it would be a tragedy to lose it.
I mean, I think between you sort of hit on where I stand at the moment, and that is, I mean, yes, more and more journalists, for example, are using encryption. I remember back in 2011 trying to get journalists involved in WikiLeaks publications, and well, do you have this thing called OTR? And no, well, well, can't you just tell me on the telephone? No, I can't. And it was a real battle. Now, yes, post-Snowden, journalists actually either have OTR already, or they're willing to learn, and they understand the reasons, and that is a great advancement. But as Renata put it, it's an element of resistance. It's not as though I don't think journalism as an industry has suddenly had massive progressions in how much truth it's bringing out since 2011. We are now in post-truth and fake news, and if anything, the actual situation really has in many ways gotten worse, albeit with some elements have, like, people understanding the need for encryption having improved. So I do see, and that's where, for me, really the hope lies in us, in the people, in that there are tools, there are good people working on these things. But as Renata's saying, we really need to all collectively get together and use these and actually push forward and really fight for the change we want, not just for the protection we want.
And one more thing, I'm very, very, very concerned, at least at the European level, and on this fake news narrative, and on the journalists of certain media, because not all media, the journalists of the well-resourced media as the Ministry of Truth. And I think that I was very excited in the early 2000s on the ability of everyone to publish their opinions, to go to the source documents, to present something, their views. And I think that I will not like to concentrate that power in mainstream media, because as WikiLeaks proves, and not only WikiLeaks, but lots of people around the world prove, media is easily corrupted, and the journalist situation globally is quite precarious. And unless we fix that, we cannot rely on mainstream media to mediate what we have to know and what we shouldn't know and what should be legitimate speech or not.
I've just been told that it will end in 5 minutes, and I've also been told before that I had so many questions to ask you, but if someone wants to ask this question to Renata or Sarah, it's now or after at the bar, because there will be at the bar. Yes. Oh, Amael.
Hi. There has been a lot of controversy surrounding WikiLeaks since the American presidential election. And what is significant is that a lot of people who used to be very supportive of the project became very critical about certain publication strategies, and also about, and maybe mostly about, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange's public communication on Twitter, which they see as very disturbing, to say the least. So I'd like to have your take on that.
When it comes to the publication strategies, from the very beginning, something that Julian had said is that we will always upset the people that we're publishing about. And I have seen that a lot of people have questioned or maybe seen a difference in the publication strategy. From the publications that I've worked on, I know that we approached it in the same way. We got documents in from anonymous sources. We verified them, we processed them as quickly as we could, and then we published them. I think especially, when it came to, for example, the DNC emails, New York Times explained...
Democrat emails.
Sorry?
DNC, speaking to the French audience. DNC is Democrat Party.
The Democratic Party emails, Hillary Clinton emails, that they would have published them as well. So for me, at least internally, on the publication strategy, I didn't see a change in that, and I certainly worked the same as I had on all of the publications. With regards to the Twitter account, I don't deal with the Twitter account. I'm not part of the PR department. I think that there was some DM stuff that came out recently, and people have seen a difference in the public tweets. I would need to have specific examples to be able to answer on any of those specifically, because it's just, well, to quote a Congress title, which therefore makes it weird to say, but not my department. So if you have a specific one, then I'm happy to talk about those with you. But from the publication strategy, which is the parts that I worked on, I know that I didn't operate in any different way on any of those.
Just because we were speaking of it, the Pentagon at the time told that WikiLeaks had blends on their hands because you revealed lots of documents without redaction, and there was a Pentagon report that was published last year who revealed that nobody has ever been killed because of the publications of WikiLeaks.
And what is interesting is that it's not the first set of emails related to a political party that WikiLeaks publishes. WikiLeaks published back in, I think, the 2007, 2008, a set of documents of the extreme right party, BNP, in the UK.
In the UK, yeah.
And then Sarah Palin emails. And many others, and I think that it was for many unfortunate the election of Trump, but you cannot blame it in a publication. I mean, it is a moment of reflection for American people, and of course it has effects everywhere in the world. I mean, I have seen it with the massive deportation, the hostile politics against Latin Americans, and the wall, and all these things that are more visible now, but I think that you cannot blame a publication, and you cannot blame if there were lies. And if it was like fake documents, it would be a different story.
And no
But you
fake
can,
documents have ever been released by
by
WikiLeaks.
by WikiLeaks, not so far. Yeah. So I mean, you cannot blame accurate documents. I mean, it would be like it is an ethical dilemma whether like you rather live with an uncomfortable truth or you prefer not to know the truth of the things. So it is a choice. I personally, I prefer to know. I'd rather know than not know, because otherwise we go back to the times of the church when you delegate your will and your decisions to superior power, and I don't like that.
And just to jump from the question is that the book doesn't deal with what happened with WikiLeaks those last year, because the conversation took place before the election of Trump. All the money will go to the Courage Foundation. That's it. And it's time to close. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Merci à vous.
Thank you.
Et elles sont là, normalement, dans la place, si vous avez d'autres questions à leur poser. Thank you.